Okay, everybody, welcome to Chapter 5, the cardiovascular system, heart, and blood vessels. So, things to think about while we're going through this. What are the functions of the cardiovascular system? What does it do, kind of a thing? What is the anatomy of the heart, of blood vessels, such as veins and arteries? And this is going to be a bit of a review since we should all be somewhat familiar with the anatomy of the heart. But we're going to get into some new stuff like veins and arteries, and what do those look like on a closer level? How is the heartbeat regulated? What are the processes that actually regulate your heartbeat? What is blood pressure, which you should already know a bit about, so we might breeze through that. We'll see. And what are common cardiovascular diseases, and how might you prevent them? And I'll probably wind up breaking this into at least a couple of different videos. So some of the stuff on the end might jump to the next section. So the cardiovascular system includes the heart and blood vessels. It brings nutrients to cells and helps those cells get rid of wastes that they produce during regular cellular processes. Blood is refreshed to the lung, kidneys, intestines, and liver, and the lymphatic vessels help it by bringing excess fluid back into the system, the cardiovascular system itself. So really quick, I just want to make sure that we are differentiating cardiovascular and cardiac versus pulmonary. So cardiac means heart, and if I'm talking about something that's cardiac, I'm talking about relating to the heart. If I'm talking about something that's pulmonary, it is referring to or related to the lungs. So again, transporting oxygen, carbon dioxide, other waste products, minerals, and hormones. It protects the cells because the sort of agents of the immune system are transported throughout it. Those are the white blood cells that you hear about and some other things. And it regulates. Like many or all of these systems, the point of them is to help maintain homeostasis inside your body. So these are the three principal functions of our cardiovascular system here: transport, protection, and regulation and homeostasis. So this is just a textual overview. You should perhaps kind of know this maybe. So you have the heart, which then blood is taken away from the heart by arteries. Remember that A stands for away from the heart. And arterioles is a concept you've never heard of before. These are branching things at the end of the arteries, at the beginning of capillaries. Capillaries are these very thin structures, which is where gas exchange and waste exchange is going to actually take place. Then from the capillaries, it goes from the venules back to the veins, and then the veins return blood to the heart. Remember, via the vena cava. So arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. Their walls have three layers. I guess really quick, let me get my pointer. Really quick, I should remind you, arteries begin with the letter A, so they carry blood away from the heart is a good way to remember it. So arteries, A, away. Arteries are composed of three layers. They have a thin inner epithelium, a thick, smooth muscle layer, and outer connective tissue. Now, if you remember the three different kinds of muscle you have smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. And you'll remember that smooth muscle is involuntary. So the smooth muscle around these is going to be squeezing on them and helping to push blood along. They also have an outer layer of connective tissue. So if you're thinking of blood flow, after the arteries come the arterioles, which are just these small arteries that regulate blood pressure through the capillary. So these things branch and allow blood to flow into the capillary from the artery. So capillaries are these microscopic vessels between arterioles, which we just talked about, artery to arteriole. and they're between the arterioles and the venules, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Capillaries are made of one layer of epithelial tissue, and they form beds of vessels where exchange with the body cells occurs. So you're able to exchange oxygen through these capillaries. So this thinness, this one layer, is so that they can kind of maximize their surface area, so that exchange between them and the cells of your body is easier. Not that capillaries aren't in your body or anything like that, but I'm just trying to distinguish here that there are these passages for blood which are helping to exchange oxygen with the rest of the cells in your body. So here's a nice picture, and this is just a stain. Once again, your blood is always red. It's just different shades of red. And you can see here you've got blood flowing in this direction and through the artery with this layer of smooth muscle all around it. It flows from the artery into the arteriole, and then from the arteriole into the capillary, which is where exchange of oxygen and CO2 can happen. And you can see how much surface area this capillary is taking up, despite being quite small. It flows from the capillary through this arteriovenous shunt. Arteriovenous, as the name implies, is between the artery and the vein. So it flows from the capillary into this thing called a venule, back into a vein, and the vein returns blood to the heart so that carbon dioxide can be released into the lungs and be breathed out. Oxygen can be put back into the blood and be taken to the body's cells. So here's another nice picture. I just kind of wanted to simplify things a little bit. It goes from the artery into the arteriole, into the capillary, where it exchanges oxygen and CO2 with your cells, and then the blood flows through the venule back out into the vein, from the vein through the vena cava back to the heart. It's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. So again, like I just talked about, venules are small veins that receive blood from the capillaries. The venule and vein are similar in structure. They have three layers. They have a thin inner epithelium, a thick, smooth muscle layer, and outer connective tissue. And veins carry blood back to the heart. And so, veins often carry blood against the force of gravity. And if you didn't have these venous valves, if you didn't have these valves in your veins, blood would kind of pool in your feet, and you'd have a bunch of deoxygenated blood just hanging out in your lower extremities. And so those valves allow to keep blood moving in one direction. So again, the principal differences here are that these veins have these valves, and they also are sort of less robust. Veins are less robust than arteries, because arteries are under cardiac pressure. They're under pressure from the heart. And so veins don't really need to be as strong as your arteries, because, they're not under nearly as much pressure as the arteries are. Another difference is that your veins, blood flow through the veins is assisted by cardiac muscle, or by not cardiac muscle, I'm sorry, via skeletal movement, where you move your muscles, and that helps the blood to get squeezed through and keep moving through the veins. Which is why if you were to stand perfectly still for a really long time, your feet would start to hurt. Your feet would, start to swell, because you don't have those skeletal muscles kind of helping to move things back around through the body, get that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So this is a bit of a review. This with this here, the pericardium. So I gave you guys credit for it on the test because nobody knew what the heck I was talking about. Um, but anyway, there's a large muscular layer consisting of mostly cardiac tissue called the myocardium. This is the muscle part of the heart, or this is, mostly the muscle part of the heart. Okay. The myocardium is surrounded by a sac called the pericardium. It's basically like if you were to just take a bag, put it around your heart, that is the pericardium. And there are two sides of the heart, the right side and the left side, which you all know about. We've talked about this several times in lab. And they are separated by the septum. Septum is a new term here. So the right side and left side are separated by this septum. There are 4 chambers that we all know about because we've done it. 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Remember, atria sort of means entryway. The atrium of a house is its entryway. The atria of a heart is its entryway. This is where blood is coming in. So blood comes in the right atria, then to the right ventricle, then through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, back to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and then it's pumped out the aorta. There are 2 sets of valves, the semilunar valves and the arterioventricular valves, and remember those are to keep blood going in the correct direction. One of these is the tricuspid valve, the other is the mitral valve, and these semilunar valves are the pulmonary and aortic valves. And the valves closing produce what you hear as a heartbeat. So remember, those valves closing produce what you are hearing, this lub-dub sound, as your heartbeat. So here is some anatomy stuff, some of which you should already know, but that's all right, we're going to do it again. So here's the right atrium connected up to the vena cava, this blue thing here, and this is where blood comes into the heart. And the right ventricle is here. Here's the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, which then goes out to the lungs. And the lungs send the blood back. Remember, A is away, A for artery is away, so this is one of the few points where arteries are going to be carrying deoxygenated blood and veins are going to be carrying oxygenated blood. But this pulmonary artery takes it to the lungs, and the lungs returns it to the heart via the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein takes blood into the left atrium, which is this piece here. I don't know, we haven't looked at the heart externally very much. We looked at the model one time, but this is good stuff to know. Here's your left atrium, which pumps it then into the very muscular left ventricle. And the left ventricle pumps blood up this direction through the aorta, and then you have the brachiocephalic artery here. It's the first one to branch. Then the left common carotid and the left subclavian. You have the right coronary here, which is supplying blood to your cardiac tissue. This is what's supplying blood to your heart to keep it going. You have your left cardiac vein here, which is taking, the deoxygenated blood that your heart is using away back up to the lungs. And then the left anterior descending coronary artery here. So there's lots of external anatomy stuff to know. I would like you to know brachiocephalic, where that goes. I'd like you to know common carotid, and I'd like you to know left subclavian. And we can talk about those probably in a later video. Inside the heart, we already looked at some of these things, but you can just see some of these things from the inside. One of the new concepts here is the septum, which is separating the 2 halves of the heart. So that's definitely one I'd like you to know. I'd like you to know the septum. It's a new term for this section. And you should remember all of these other things. You know, you've got your right atrium, your right ventricle, your tricuspid valve, your pulmonary valve or your semilunar valve, your left atrium, your mitral valve or your arterioventricular bicuspid valve, your left ventricle, you know, your aorta, your aortic arch, and your descending aorta. So again, this is all review, but this is stuff that we're going to hit in the next test, or you're going to have to know for the next test. So if you don't remember it from the last section, please go back and review some of these things. Another new thing is these chordae tendineae here, and these papillary muscles here, which are going to actually control the closing of this tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. So chordae tendineae, important thing to know. Papillary muscles, another important thing to know. So I wanted to talk about the cardiac muscles. So, you know, those cardiac muscles are the myocardium. They're sort of all over the place in your heart. And I wanted to talk about what they look like for a moment. So you'll notice they have these things called intercalated discs, which is sort of how these muscles fibers are connected to one another. And these intercalated discs consist of desmosomes, which keep these different cells tightly connected to one another, and these things called gap junctions. Remember, there are 3 different ways in which cells can be connected to one another, and gap junctions are one of those. So these gap junctions allow cells to communicate with one another, and the desmosomes allow them to be tightly connected. So they are able to communicate with one another, which I'll get into in a minute, why that's important. So you'll notice that these cardiac muscles branch extensively. They can be multinucleated. Their nuclei are in the middle as opposed to skeletal muscle, which usually has one cell with a bunch of nuclei kind of all over the place. These cardiac muscles are 1 or 2 nuclei typically. They're connected by intercalated discs, which again have the gap junction so that cells can communicate, and the desmosomes so that they are tightly connected. And again, it allows tight connection and communication. And the other thing that's important about these cardiac muscles is that they're loaded with mitochondria. They're loaded with mitochondria. And the reason for that is because you don't want your heart, hopefully you don't want your heart to run out of energy. That would be bad for everyone. So these are loaded down with mitochondria, keep the heart pumping, keep the blood flowing. So this is just looking back at the picture. You see they're loaded with these mitochondria. They do in fact branch, whereas with skeletal muscle you might think of really one super long cell with many nuclei that doesn't really branch ever. You'll notice this picture of this cross section. It's got a bunch of these mitochondria in it, those kidney bean looking things, to make lots of energy. So this is what a gap junction looks like, and I'm not as worried about you knowing what this simulated histology looks like. I just want you to see that there is an opening here that is allowing the cells to communicate with one another chemically. So these gap junctions are allowing for chemical communication between muscle cells. This chemical communication is going to be important later on when we get to regulation of the heartbeat, pacemaker cells, and why those might be important. Not why they might be important, why those are for sure important. So this is, again, this is review from the last section, but you need to know this. So we're going to hit it again. So again, The vena cava dumps blood into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it goes into the right ventricle. I made an entire video about this, so if this is going too fast, please go check that out. From the right ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary arteries that lead into the lungs, where blood picks up oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. Then it goes into the pulmonary veins, which brings blood from the lungs back into the left atrium, where then it goes to the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is a very, very muscular portion of the heart, and it's very large, and that pumps blood into the aorta, and then from the aorta it goes out to the rest of the body. Eventually, blood will come back via the vena cava to the right atrium. Okay, so if you need pictures to go along with this, check out the video I made, but this is stuff that you all need to know. You need to know how blood flows through the heart. It's very important. I'm actually going to stop here. This video is getting a little long, but that is just kind of a setup for Chapter 5, and we can continue talking about this stuff in the next video.